Lady Seraphina Thorne decided to let her life end not with a bang, but with the quiet, suffocating rustle of silk against a ballroom wall. She had become a fixture, a piece of the architecture as overlooked as the faded cherubs painted on the ceiling. At 27, she was a relic of seasons past, a spinster whose social currency had long been spent. The music swelled, a wave of violins that washed over the glittering assembly, but never quite reached the shadowed alcove where she stood. It was her fourth ball of the season, and not a single gentleman had approached her. Her dance card remained pristine, a small, white rectangle of her own invisibility. Her mother, a woman whose smiles were as sharp as her criticisms, glided over. Lady Thorne's fan fluttered like a trapped bird. "Really, Seraphina," she whispered, her voice a sliver of ice. "Must you look so morose? You will curdle the champagne." Seraphina offered a smile that felt like cracking porcelain. "I am merely appreciating the music, Mother." "You are appreciating the wallpaper," her mother corrected, her eyes scanning the room for more promising prospects for her younger, prettier daughter, Clara. "Your father and I cannot keep this up forever. The expense is considerable. You must try." Try. The word fell like a stone into the frozen pond of Seraphina's despair. She had tried. For 9 seasons she had tried. She had smiled. She had curtsied. She had mastered witty repartee and the art of looking interested in conversations about horses and politics. It had yielded nothing. She was pleasant, but not beautiful. Intelligent, but not dazzling. She was simply Seraphina. And in a world that valued ornamentation, she was plain, sturdy wood. She watched her sister Clara laugh, her head tilted back as a young lord hung on her every word. Clara was a sunbeam, effortless and bright. Seraphina was the shadow that followed, a constant, quiet reminder of what happened when a daughter failed to secure her future. Later that night, the pretense of hope was finally stripped away. Her father summoned her to his study, a room that always smelled of old paper and resignation. Lord Fawn did not meet her eyes, focusing instead on a stack of bills held down by a heavy brass paperweight. "The accounts are not favourable, Seraphina," he began, his voice heavy. "We cannot afford another season for you." Her heart, a dull and steady thing, gave a painful lurch. She had known this was coming, but the finality of it still stole her breath. "I understand, Father." "No, I do not think you do," he said, finally looking up. His eyes were tired, tinged with a frustration that was directed entirely at her. "We are in dire straits. Your sister must be provided for. We have an offer for you." A chill, colder than any winter draft, snaked its way up her spine. An offer. At her age, offers were not matters of romance. They were transactions of desperation. "Who is it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Viscount Crowley," her father said, the name leaving a sour taste in the air. Seraphina's stomach turned. Viscount Crowley was a man twice her age, with a wet mouth and hands that lingered far too long. He had buried 2 wives already, and rumour said he had hastened their departures. His gaze made her skin crawl. The thought of being bound to him was a horror beyond imagining. "He is a repugnant man," she stated, the words flat and devoid of the panic screaming inside her. "He is a wealthy man," her father countered. "He is willing to overlook your situation in exchange for a connection to our name. It is the only way, Seraphina. It is your duty to this family." Her duty? To be sold like livestock to save a name that had brought her nothing but obscurity. She stood there, her hands clenched at her sides, the room seeming to tilt around her. This was the end of her life. She would be handed over to a monster, her quiet world of books and botanical drawings replaced by a cage with gilded bars. Despair was no longer a pond. It was an ocean, and she was drowning in it. "I see," she said, the two words a testament to her complete and utter defeat. There was nothing more to say. She was trapped. 2 days later, a carriage bearing the crest of the Duke of Beaumont thundered to a stop before their modest London townhouse. It was an arrival so unexpected, so far beyond the scope of their social sphere, that it sent the entire household into a frenzy. The Dowager Duchess of Beaumont, a woman who could make kings tremble with a single arched eyebrow, was announced. She swept into their drawing room like a storm clad in black silk, her posture ramrod straight, her eyes sharp and assessing. Seraphina's mother nearly fainted. The Dowager Duchess was a legend, a creature of immense power who rarely ventured into society anymore. "Lady Thorne," the Duchess said, her voice like gravel and old money. She did not sit. "I am here on a matter of business." Before she could continue, the butler, pale and flustered, announced another arrival. His Grace, the Duke of Beaumont. If the Dowager's arrival was a storm, the Duke's was a cataclysm. Alistair Beaumont, the Iron Duke, was a man carved from granite and shadow. He was impossibly wealthy, ruthlessly powerful, and notoriously reclusive. He was famous for one thing above all: his cold, methodical rejection of every eligible bride paraded before him for the past decade. His presence in their drawing room was so incongruous, it felt like a hallucination. He moved with a silent, predatory grace, his dark eyes missing nothing. He bowed stiffly to her mother, his expression unreadable, a mask of cold indifference. Seraphina felt his gaze pass over her for a fraction of a second, as dismissive as if she were a piece of furniture. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage of bone. Why were they here? The Dowager Duchess did not waste time with pleasantries. "My grandson requires a wife," she announced, the statement dropping into the stunned silence of the room. "I have grown tired of his obstinacy. Therefore, I have made the selection for him." She turned her piercing gaze directly upon Seraphina. "I have chosen Lady Seraphina Thorne." The world stopped. Seraphina could hear the blood roaring in her ears. Her mother made a small, choking sound. Her father's jaw had fallen open. It was a joke, a cruel, elaborate jest. The Iron Duke, who had refused the most beautiful and well-connected ladies in the kingdom, was being offered her? The wallflower? The spinster on the verge of being sold to Viscount Crowley? Humiliation, hot and swift, washed over her. She braced herself for the Duke's rejection. It would be swift, brutal, and utterly final. He would laugh, or sneer, or simply turn and walk away, leaving her dignity in tatters on the worn Aubusson carpet. Duke Alistair Beaumont said nothing. He simply turned his head and looked at her. It was the first time anyone of consequence had truly looked at her in years. His eyes were not cold, as she had expected. They were dark, intense, and held a depth she could not fathom. He studied her face, his gaze lingering for a moment that stretched into an eternity. The room was so quiet, she was sure he could hear the frantic beat of her heart. She waited for the axe to fall, for the dismissal that would cement her status as a social pariah forever. Then his voice, low and resonant, cut through the tension. "I accept." The shock in the room was a physical force. Seraphina swayed on her feet, her mind unable to process the two words. He accepted. The Iron Duke accepted her. It made no sense. It was impossible. There had to be a mistake, a hidden clause, a cruel motive she could not yet comprehend. He had not smiled. His expression had not changed. But he had looked at her, and he had accepted. And in that moment, Seraphina's life, which had been a slow, inexorable march towards a miserable end, was utterly and irrevocably shattered. She had been saved from one prison, only to be thrust, bewildered and terrified, into another, far grander one. Their marriage was a swift, sterile affair. A special license, a quiet ceremony, and then she was the Duchess of Beaumont, whisked away to a life of unimaginable wealth and suffocating silence. Beaumont Hall was less a home and more a monument, a vast stone edifice that seemed to watch her with cold, indifferent eyes. Alistair, her husband, was a ghost within its walls. He was unfailingly polite, a perfect gentleman. He ensured she had everything she could possibly need: a lavish suite of rooms, a generous allowance, a staff that catered to her every whim. Everything except his presence. They shared breakfast in a dining hall so long their voices would have had to travel a great distance to meet. He would read his papers, she would stare into her tea. They spoke only when necessary. "Good morning, Your Grace," she would say. "Good morning, Duchess," he would reply. The titles were walls between them, reinforcing the formal, transactional nature of their union. She felt like a curator in a museum of her own life. She wandered the long, silent corridors, her footsteps echoing on the marble floors. The portraits of past Beaumonts stared down at her, their expressions ranging from stern to haughty. She was an imposter here, and she knew it. The staff was deferential but distant, their gazes filled with a quiet curiosity. They were all waiting to see what would become of the plain, penniless spinster who had somehow snared the uncatchable Iron Duke. To escape the crushing weight of the house, she sought refuge in the one place that felt like it might hold a whisper of life: the estate's conservatory. It was vast but neglected. Dust coated the glass panes, and the exotic plants within were either dead or dying, their brown leaves crumbling to the touch. It was a beautiful ruin, a reflection of how she felt inside. She began spending her days there, sketching the skeletal remains of ferns and orchids in her journal. It was a melancholy pastime, but it was hers. One afternoon, lost in the intricate details of a withered passion flower vine, she did not hear him approach. "You have a talent for detail," Alistair's voice said from behind her. Seraphina jumped, her charcoal pencil clattering to the stone floor. Her heart leaped into her throat. He stood there, dressed not in his formal London attire, but in a simple shirt and breeches, looking solid and strangely out of place amongst the decay. "Your Grace," she stammered, scrambling to her feet and curtsying. "You startled me." He bent and retrieved her pencil, his long fingers closing around it before handing it back to her. His hand brushed hers, a brief, accidental contact that was warmer than she expected. "My apologies," he said, his eyes glancing at her drawing. "It is a sad subject." "I find a certain beauty in it," she confessed, feeling bold. "In what it used to be." He looked around the conservatory, a flicker of something, regret, perhaps, in his eyes. "My mother loved this place. It has not been cared for since she passed." He said nothing more, simply gave her a curt nod and left as silently as he had arrived. Seraphina assumed that was the end of it. But the next morning, she awoke to the sounds of activity. From her window, she saw a small army of gardeners descending upon the conservatory. They spent the next week cleaning glass, repairing the structure, and bringing in cart after cart of new exotic plants. When they were finished, the place was transformed. It was a lush, green paradise, filled with vibrant orchids, towering ferns, and fragrant jasmine. On a small work table in her preferred corner, a brand new set of professional drawing pencils, charcoals, and fine French paper was arranged. There was no note. There was no explanation. He never mentioned it. At their silent breakfasts, his expression remained as unreadable as ever. But when she hesitantly thanked him, a formal, practiced speech she had rehearsed all morning, he simply met her eyes across the long table and said, "It is my pleasure, Duchess. A place of beauty should not be left to ruin." The words hung in the air, seeming to mean more than they said. It was the first crack in his iron armor, the first hint that there was a man beneath the cold, ducal facade. It did not make her understand him, but it made her intensely, frighteningly curious. The curiosity was a dangerous seed. It began to sprout a few weeks later, at a ball hosted by the Marquis of Ashworth. It was their first major social event as a married couple, and Seraphina felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her. Whispers followed them like the rustle of silk, dissecting her gown, her posture, her very existence. She was standing near a refreshment table when she overheard Lady Beatrice, a diamond of the first water, who had once been considered the front-runner for the Beaumont title, speaking to her friends. Her voice was deliberately loud, meant to carry. "I cannot fathom it," Lady Beatrice said with a theatrical sigh. "He could have had anyone, and he chooses a dried-up little wallflower. They say his grandmother forced the match. It must be a marriage in name only. Can you imagine him, the Iron Duke, in a bed with her?" The cruel laughter of her companions was like a physical blow. Seraphina froze, her fingers tightening around the stem of her champagne flute until she thought it might shatter. She wanted the floor to swallow her whole. Before she could flee, a shadow fell over the group. Alistair had materialized at her side, his presence so sudden and absolute that all conversation ceased. He did not look at Seraphina. His gaze was fixed on Lady Beatrice, and it was glacial. "Lady Beatrice," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the unmistakable ring of command. "I find your concern for my marital affairs touching. However, allow me to reassure you. My wife is everything I could ever desire. Her wit, her intelligence, and her grace far outshine the shallow glitter of a ballroom. I pity those who are too blind to see it." He paused, letting the silence stretch until it was excruciating. "Perhaps you should concern yourself with your own prospects. I hear they are dwindling." The insult was so precise, so devastating, that a collective gasp went through the onlookers. Lady Beatrice's face went from pale to crimson. Without another word, Alistair placed a light hand on the small of Seraphina's back and guided her away, leaving the humiliated woman in his wake. His touch was a brand, a small point of heat that seemed to burn through the fabric of her gown. He led her to a deserted terrace overlooking the gardens. The cool night air was a relief against her flushed cheeks. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice losing its icy edge, replaced by something that sounded almost like concern. "Yes," she whispered, though she was trembling. "Thank you. You did not have to do that." "I did," he said simply. "You are the Duchess of Beaumont. An insult to you is an insult to me." She looked up at him then, at his stoic profile outlined against the moonlight. It was a defense of his name, his title, not of her. And yet, the way he had spoken of her wit and grace, the fire in his eyes as he'd defended her, it felt personal. The confusion within her deepened, a tangled knot of fear and a fragile, burgeoning hope. This man was a fortress, but she was beginning to see hairline fractures in his walls. One night, unable to sleep, she wandered down to the library in search of a book. A single lamp burned on a desk in the far corner, casting long shadows across the room. Alistair was there, his back to her. He was not reading or working on his estate papers. He was simply sitting, staring at a small, dark object he held in the palm of his hand. His shoulders, usually so straight and unyielding, were slumped. The posture was one of profound loneliness, an unguarded moment of sorrow that felt intensely private. She felt a pang of empathy for this cold, distant man who was her husband. She must have made a sound, a soft intake of breath, because he stiffened. He quickly closed his hand, concealing the object, and turned. The mask of the Iron Duke slammed back into place. "Duchess," he said, his voice cool and formal once more. "Is there something you require?" "No, nothing. I was just looking for a book," she stammered, feeling like an intruder. "I will leave you to your work." She fled back to her rooms, her heart pounding. What had he been holding with such reverence? What secret sorrow did the powerful Duke of Beaumont carry that could make him look so utterly broken in the dead of night? Every time she thought she understood the nature of their strange arrangement, he revealed another layer of complexity, another mystery that drew her in against her will. He was an enigma, and she was beginning to fear that solving it would cost her what little peace she had found. Her mother arrived for a visit a week later, her presence filling the grand manor with an anxiety Seraphina had almost forgotten. Lady Thorne surveyed the opulent surroundings with a mixture of envy and suspicion. "He gives you all of this," she said, running a gloved finger over a gilded table. "But does he give you his time? Does he speak to you, Seraphina?" "He is a busy man," Seraphina replied, the defense sounding weak even to her own ears. "He is a cold man," her mother corrected, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "It is not natural. People in London are talking. They say he is cruel, that his heart is a stone. They wonder what he wants with you." The words were poison darts, each one finding its mark in Seraphina's own insecurities. What could he possibly want? "He is using you," her mother insisted, her eyes wide with a sort of morbid excitement. "Perhaps it is your family name, insignificant as it is. Perhaps you are a cover for some other arrangement. A man like that does not act without reason, and love is clearly not the reason here. Be careful, daughter. He is a dangerous man." The warning lingered long after her mother's carriage departed, a toxic cloud that settled over the fragile peace Seraphina had begun to build. Was she a fool? Was his kindness, the conservatory, his defense of her, just a calculated part of a larger, inscrutable plan? The fear her mother had planted began to take root, choking the tentative shoots of curiosity and hope. The annual Beaumont Garden Party, a grand affair for the local gentry and tenants, brought her fears into sharp focus. The day was bright and sunny, but a shadow fell over her when she saw Viscount Crowley among the guests. He was a tenant on a neighbouring estate, and his presence was unavoidable. She tried to avoid him, but he cornered her near a rose trellis, his bulk blocking her escape. His eyes, small and piggy, roamed over her with a possessive familiarity that made her skin crawl. "Your Grace," he said, his voice thick with false deference and wine. "You look well. Marriage suits you. Though I must confess, I am surprised the Duke allows his treasures to wander unattended. I am not a treasure to be guarded, Lord Crowley, Seraphina said, her voice colder than she intended. Now, if you will excuse me. She tried to step around him, but he moved to block her again. Come now, he wheezed. No need to be shy. We were almost family. I would have taken good care of you. Better than a man made of ice. He reached out, his fleshy hand aiming for her arm. Before his fingers could touch her, a hand shot out and clamped around his wrist. Alistair stood there, his face a thundercloud. He had moved so silently, so quickly, that neither of them had seen him approach. Lord Crowley, Alistair said, his voice dangerously soft. You will remove your hand. You will apologize to my wife. And then you will leave my property. If I ever see you speak to her again, I will personally ensure that your tenancy on the Ashworth estate is terminated. Is that clear? The Viscount paled, his bravado evaporating under the sheer menace in the Duke's gaze. He snatched his hand back as if burned. My apologies, Your Grace, he stammered, bowing clumsily before practically fleeing across the lawn. Alistair turned to her, the fury in his eyes softening as he looked at her. He did not harm you? No, she whispered, her voice unsteady. He reached out, his own hand hesitating for a moment before it gently touched her elbow, a steadying, protective gesture. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt of warmth through her, chasing away the chill the Viscount had left behind. I am sorry you had to endure that, he said, his thumb stroking the silk of her sleeve in a small, almost unconscious gesture of comfort. This was not the act of a man using her as a shield. This was not the cold calculation her mother had described. This was raw, protective anger. His defense of her was swift and absolute, and the brief, gentle touch afterwards spoke of a care that contradicted everything she thought she knew about him. The knot of confusion inside her tightened until it was painful. She had to know the truth. Who was Alistair Beaumont, and why, of all the women in the world, had he chosen her? That night, she found her courage. She could not live in this state of uncertainty any longer, caught between fear and a fragile, inexplicable hope. The silence between them was a chasm, and she was going to force him to build a bridge, or watch her fall. She found him where she knew he would be, in the vast library, the lamplight carving him out of the darkness. He was staring into the fire, the mysterious small object once again in his hand. This time, she would not retreat. She walked across the thick carpet, her soft slippers making no sound until she stood directly before him. He looked up, his eyes widening in surprise at her proximity, at the determined set of her jaw. Seraphina? He asked, using her given name for the first time since their wedding vows. He made a move to hide the object, but her gaze was fixed on his hand. What is that? She asked, her voice quiet but firm. He hesitated. Then, slowly, reluctantly, he opened his palm. Lying there was a single dried rose petal. It was brown and fragile with age, but she could see it had once been a deep, velvety crimson. Why? She asked, her real question hanging unspoken in the air between them. Why me? Why any of this? He finally met her eyes, and she saw the fortress walls crumble. The Iron Duke was gone, and in his place was a man who looked vulnerable, haunted, and achingly weary. I owe you the truth, he said, his voice rough with emotion. All of it. He gestured to the chair opposite his. She sat, her hands clasped in her lap, her entire being focused on him. "It was 10 years ago," he began, his gaze distant, lost in memory. "At your first season, the Danbury Ball. Do you remember it?" She searched her memory, a haze of faces, music, and crushing anxiety. "Vaguely," she admitted. "I spent most of it hiding in the conservatory." A small, sad smile touched his lips. "I know. I was there too. Hiding, just like you." He looked down at the petal in his hand. Everyone was fawning over the debutantes, discussing their dowries and connections. It was a marketplace. But you were not part of it. You were in the corner with old Lord Hemlock, the botanist. You were not talking about gossip or fashion. You were arguing with him, quite passionately, about the classification of a specific type of climbing rose. Serafina stared at him, stunned. She remembered that. She had been so nervous, but the old lord had been kind, and for a few minutes she had forgotten where she was and had simply been herself, talking about the one thing she loved. "I watched you," Alistair continued, his voice low. "You were so alive, so intelligent. Your eyes lit up when you spoke of it. You were the only real person in that entire gilded room. Everyone else was playing a part. You were just you." He paused, taking a breath. "As you were leaving the conservatory, the petal from the rose in your hair fell to the floor. I picked it up after you were gone." He held out his hand, showing her the fragile relic. "I have kept it ever since." The confession was so staggering, so utterly unbelievable, that Serafina could not speak. He had seen her. 10 years ago, a man she did not even know had seen her, truly seen her, in a way no one else ever had. "I wanted to approach you," he said, his voice filled with a decade of regret. "But I was a coward. My father had just died. The dukedom, with all its pressures and responsibilities, had fallen on me. My family has a history of darkness, of coldness. I looked at you, so full of life and quiet passion, and I felt I had nothing but shadow to offer. I was not worthy of you. So I built walls," he admitted, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I became the Iron Duke. It was a shield, to keep everyone out, but mostly to keep me from reaching for the one thing I truly wanted. I rejected every bride my grandmother put before me because none of them were you. I could not have you, but I would not settle for anyone else." He finally looked up, his eyes pleading, stripped of all artifice. "When my grandmother summoned me to your house that day, when she announced she had chosen you, it felt like a miracle, a trick of fate. A chance I was too afraid to make for myself was being handed to me. I accepted because I knew I would never get another opportunity. I was terrified you would refuse. And since we married," he confessed, his voice barely a whisper, "my distance, my formality, it has all been fear. Fear that you would see the man behind the title and find him wanting. Fear that you would realize you were trapped with a lonely, foolish man who has loved you from afar for a decade." Silence descended, thick and heavy with the weight of his words. The secret history of their lives lay between them, a story of missed chances and silent devotion. Serafina's mind reeled, reframing every cold glance, every formal word, every protective gesture. It was not disdain. It was not a strategy. It was terror. A deep, abiding fear of rejection from a man who had loved her before she even knew his name. She thought of her own secret. She remembered that ball, too. She remembered a tall, dark-haired man in the shadows of the conservatory, watching, his expression intense and serious. He had not been like the other young bucks, preening and posturing. He had seemed solitary, real. She had felt a strange pull, a momentary connection to the quiet stranger, before her mother had dragged her away. She had never known who he was, until now. A profound sense of shared loss washed over her. All those years, all those lonely nights in their separate wings of the same house, all the silence that could have been filled with words. She rose from her chair and crossed the small space between them. He watched her, his expression uncertain, bracing himself for her verdict. She did not speak. Instead, she knelt before his chair, a duchess on her knees before her duke. Gently, she took his hand, the one holding the fragile petal. She uncurled his tense fingers, her touch a soft question. He let her. She looked from the petal to his face, at the vulnerable man he had hidden for so long. Alistair, she said, his name a soft caress. You should have just told me. Leaning forward, she closed the last of the distance between them. She pressed her lips to his in a kiss that was not about passion, but about acceptance. It was a kiss of profound relief, of homecoming. It was the end of a decade of silence and the beginning of everything else. He responded with a desperation that shattered the last of her doubts, his hand coming up to cup her cheek as if she were the most precious thing in the world. 2 years later, the morning sun streamed into the conservatory at Beaumont Hall. It was no longer a place of beautiful ruins, but a vibrant, living testament to a love that had finally been allowed to bloom. Serafina's detailed botanical illustrations, framed in elegant silver, now hung on the walls of the main house, replacing the stern portraits of long-dead ancestors. Laughter, a sound once foreign to these halls, echoed from the glass-paned room. Serafina was at her workbench, putting the finishing touches on a watercolor of a rare Amazonian lily that had bloomed for the first time that morning. Alistair stood behind her, his arms wrapped around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. He was no longer the Iron Duke, a man of granite and shadow. The years of fear had melted away, replaced by a quiet, joyful contentment that radiated from him. He smiled easily now, especially when he looked at her. "It is perfect, my love," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear. "You have captured it exactly." "It is an extraordinary flower," she replied, adding a final, delicate brushstroke. "Patient. It took years to bloom." "The best things often do," he said, his voice soft. He placed a gentle kiss on her temple. A small cry interrupted them. In a nearby playpen, surrounded by soft blankets, a 1-year-old boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's curious eyes pushed himself to his feet, holding on to the wooden rail. He babbled happily, reaching a chubby hand towards them. They turned together, a shared smile on their faces. Alistair released her and walked over, lifting their son into his arms. The boy giggled, tangling his small hands in his father's cravat. Serafina watched them, her heart so full she felt it might burst. This was her life now. Not a cage, not a transaction, but a garden she had cultivated with the man who had seen the flower when everyone else saw only the wall. Her worth had never been for society to decide. It had been waiting quietly, all this time, to be recognized by the one person who mattered. It was a powerful reminder that love could be patient and quiet, and that it was never, ever too late to begin again.